Okay, good morning, everyone. It is my pleasure to welcome you. My name is Claire Sufrin, and I am an associate professor of instruction and Jewish studies and the assistant director of the Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies at Northwestern University. It's my pleasure to welcome you, not just in general, but specifically to a panel discussion on the theme of In Between, Arab Jews in Palestine, Eretz Israel at the turn of the 20th century. Today's event is the first in a series of 5 on Arab Jewish culture, identity, and language, past and present. A couple of quick logistical notes before I hand it over to my colleagues. First, as I already noted, there will be a number of additional events in connection with the larger theme of Arab Jews. You are welcome. We invite you to come to the other events. I want to note that you can invite people who aren't here today to join you as well. Although the theme is connected, the events very much will stand alone. So we'll put the link in the chat to our website where you can sign up for those Zooms that are coming up in the future. You'll see as well that we have our annual Klutznick lecture coming up in just a few weeks. In addition, I want to note that closed captioning is available for those who would like to take advantage of it. You can simply click on the little live transcript button at the bottom of your screen. And if you have questions at any point during the program, you can go ahead and type those into the Q&A section of the website. Again, it's just a little button you click on the bottom, and those will go to our panelists to be addressed when we get to the Q&A portion of today's program. I want to recognize my colleague, Maayan Hillel, a postdoctoral fellow in Israel Studies at the Crown Family Center. Maayan is a creative and dynamic scholar and teacher, and Northwestern faculty and students have all benefited tremendously from her presence over the last 2 years, and we're actually thrilled that she'll be with us for a third. She has truly taken this series of events from an idea to a reality, and we're all quite grateful for everything that we're going to learn. So with that, I will hand it over to Maayan to introduce today's program.
Thank you so much, Claire. I'm very happy and excited that the series of events is coming to fruition and starting today. It is important for me to say that I'm grateful for the opportunity I was given by the Crown Family Center to organize the series, and for the support of David Chayovitz, yours, Claire, and of course, Nancy and Katie for your diligence and hard work. So thank you so much. So in general, as Claire mentioned, this series of events expresses the growing interest in recent years in the history and the culture of Jews from Arab and Muslim countries, as well as of Mizrahim in Israel. In fact, until recently, the topic of Arab Jews did not receive serious scholarly attention in either Jewish studies or Middle Eastern studies, nor in Israel studies, and it very much fell through the cracks of these separate disciplines. Fortunately, in recent years, more and more scholars, the most prominent amongst them participating in this series of events, have begun focusing on Arab Jews, Sephardi Jews, Arabite Jews, Oriental Jews, or Mizrahim. And by doing so, they multiply, deepen, and complicate our knowledge and understanding about the history, culture, politics, languages, and diverse experiences of Arab Jews. Now, alongside academic scholars, also Jewish Israeli and non-Israeli artists, musicians, writers, poets, singers, and comedians have recently begun to explore their roots and affinity for the Arabic language, heritage, and culture. So the events in this series are intended to examine some of these developments, to shed light on the fluidity of these identities, and to discuss the growing Mizrahi Renaissance in Israel, which draws inspiration from Arab Jewish sources and reflects a wide range of cultural influences and close contact with the region of the Middle East and North Africa on its Arab and Muslim elements. In that sense, the series joins a current global trend of acknowledging neglected identities, as the different events give voice and agency to these people, to their distinct culture, legacy, and history, including my own. So the opening panel today will examine various experiences and actions of Arab Jews from historical perspective, focusing on Palestine, Eretz Israel, at the turn of the 20th century. The next event, which will take place in exactly 2 weeks, will discuss different manifestations of Arab Jewish culture in Israel today, its producers, consumers, as well as gatekeepers. The third event of the series will host Ta'ir Chaim, the lead singer and founder of the internationally acclaimed group Iowa, for a live performance and conversation about her music and sources of inspiration. Then, the following event will focus on Arab Jewish intersecting identities. We will look at aspects of gender and protest both in Israel and Morocco, and it will highlight the complexity of the Arab Jewish identity through the incredible story of a Palestinian refugee who discovered she is a Sephardi Jew. And last but not least, the closing event will host the renowned Israeli singer Ziv Heskel, an ex-Orthodox yeshiva student who writes and sings classical and original Arabic music, and who has become a star in Israel and in the Arab music world. So, without further ado, I would like to introduce our today's chair and moderator, Louis Fishman. Louis is an associate professor in the history department at Brooklyn College, City University of New York. He's the author of the book, Jews and Palestinians in Late Ottoman Era, 1908 to 1914, Claiming the Homeland, recently reprinted in paperback. His academic work focuses on late Ottoman Palestine, the Jews of the Ottoman Empire, and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He also is a regular contributor for the Israeli newspaper Eretz, where he writes mostly about Turkish and Israeli politics, and he divides his time between New York, Istanbul, and Tel Aviv. So Louis, the stage is yours.
First of all, thanks so much for having me today. I'm so happy to chair this wonderful panel that we're going to have today. 1 second here. Very good, yes. Today's talk, In Between Arab Jews in Palestine, Eretz Israel at the turn of the century. We're bringing 3 fantastic scholars. All of them who've made a real print on the topic itself. So for the viewers today, I think you're very lucky to have such an important group of speakers. Today we'll be joined by Abigail Jacobson at the Hebrew University, Yuval Ivri from the King's College London, and Lital Levy from Princeton University. Today's talk, in fact, we'll start off with Abigail Jacobson, who is a senior lecturer at the Department of Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Her research focuses on social and urban history of late Ottoman and Mandatory Palestine and the Eastern Mediterranean. She is the author of 2 books, the first entitled From Empire to Empire, Jerusalem Between Ottoman and British Rule, and the second, Oriental Neighbors, Middle Eastern Jews and Arabs in Mandatory Palestine, which is co-authored by Moshe Noor. Today's talk, she's going to be presenting the talk title, Oriental Jews between local Arabs and the Zionist movement. So this is a real honor to have Abigail here, and who's also a very good friend. So it's great being here with her and all the other speakers. So please go ahead. Welcome to the panel, Abigail. Let's see here, wait a second. Here she is, very good.
Yes,
please.
Can you hear me? All right, great. All right, thank you very much, Louis. Thank you very much, Maayan, for organizing this fantastic series, which looks so promising, and I really hope I'll be able to attend all the sessions. all the coming sessions. I'm going to work with a PowerPoint, so I'm just going to turn this on. Can you see the PowerPoint? Hopefully you can. All right. So first of all, I just want to start by saying that this talk is based on the book that I co-authored with Moshe Naor. So this is a joint effort. I'm the one presenting it today. In the summer of 1947, the UN sent a special inquiry committee to Palestine in order to find out what would be the best solution to what was known as the Palestine problem. Its members met many Arab and Jewish representatives of different groups and interviewed them. One of them was Eliyahu Eliashar, a central political figure among the Sephardi community in Palestine. Referring to his fellow Sephardi Jews, he said, quote, "Having been born in Oriental countries, knowing the Arabs' customs and languages, their mode of life and their ethics, knowing the Arabs' customs, the Sephardim are called upon to play a greater role in the establishment of harmony and peace through the Middle Eastern countries," end of quote. Eliashar's comments represent the unique view and position of the Oriental Jews in Palestine vis-a-vis both the Arab community as well as within the Jewish community in the country during the years of the British mandate in Palestine. It is these complex links and unique positions and identity that represent a way of imagining the future of Jewish and Arab lives in Palestine and the Mediterranean that are the central focus of my talk today. My main argument today is that examining the relations between Jews and Arabs through the perspective of Sephardi and Oriental Jews sheds new light not only on the complexities and nuances of the Arab-Jewish conflict in Palestine, but also on the Zionist perspective towards it, which was crystallized mainly in the 1930s under the leadership of Mapai and Labor Zionism. By focusing on the Sephardi and Oriental Jews, one can locate, on the one hand, patterns of close connections, coexistence, and cooperation between Jews and Arabs, and at the same time, also many points of tension and friction between the two people. Oriental Jews moved between different locales in the Middle East, while crossing geographical borders as well as boundaries of their own identity. Palestinian, Sephardi, and Oriental Jews maintained cultural, educational, economic, religious, political, and social links with their peers in the Arab world, studied in universities in Cairo and Beirut, taught in Hebrew schools in Baghdad, Damascus, Alexandria, and other cities, and wrote in various newspapers edited by Jews and Arabs in Palestine and other countries in the Middle East. In fact, Sephardi and Oriental Jews in Palestine were part of a Levantine space and expressed the existence of an intellectual community that encouraged a debate on the nature of past and future relations between Arabs and Jews. The special position within the Palestinian and Levantine surroundings demonstrate the unique Jewish-Arab identity of Sephardi and Oriental Jews. They formed a group that could bridge between the Arab and Jewish identities as well as between geographical boundaries. In other words, they served as potential mediators, not only between the old and new Yishuv in Palestine and between Jewish and Arab communities, but also between Jewish and Arab identities. In order to analyze the position of Sephardi and Oriental Jews within the complex matrix of relations between Jews and Arabs in Palestine, I use the charged concept of mediation as playing out in different spheres. And here today, we'll be able to present only a few of these spheres. In the book that we wrote together, we discuss many other spheres as well. Those spheres include the political, security, cultural, journalistic, linguistic, and social ones. The term mediation consists of various meanings, and it depends upon context and historical realities. Among other meanings, cultural mediation, which I'll discuss briefly today, refers to the creation of bridges and contacts among cultures, whereas political mediators are viewed as those go-betweens who act within the context of political conflicts of different types, such as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The term mediators is used here in different contexts. These forms of mediation complemented each other and often could not be separated. Moreover, the cultural form of mediation had political implications, as did the social mediation, including its economic and security aspects. The perception and self-perception of Oriental and Sephardi Jews as possible mediators was based, among other factors, on their historical links and roots in the Middle East, even before the rise of Islam. Their cultural and linguistic links and connections to Arab culture and their fluency in Arabic also added to the way that they were viewed as mediators between the Zionist movement and the Arabs in Palestine. Many among the local Jews were enthusiastic, but though often also critical Zionists, supporters of the Zionist movement and the Zionist work in Palestine. At the same time, however, they viewed themselves as cultural, linguistic, and political mediators between Jews and Arabs, and as serving as potential bridge between the two national and ethnic communities. These notions that seems contradictory at first existed simultaneously within them. This was for many of them their special and unique form of Zionism, their interpretation of Zionism, and a way of connecting between the ethnic and national questions. Moreover, the cultural, social, and political spheres enabled them also to maintain their own Jewish Arab identity and integrate it within the national and political project of Zionism. In the cultural sphere, for example, the fact that the Sephardi and Oriental Jews were fluent in Arabic, were engaged in literary translations from Hebrew to Arabic and vice versa, taught and studied in institutions throughout the Arab world, and were also engaged in teaching Arabic in Palestine, all contributed to their self-perception as possible go-betweens among Jews and Arabs. The journalistic arena serves as yet another good example for demonstrating how this group of Oriental Jews sought to create a cultural and political exchange, and how these two spheres were viewed by them as being closely connected to each other. These affinities and contacts highlighted the presence of a cultural community of educated Jews and Arabs who cooperated and exchanged ideas through the medium of the Arabic and Hebrew press in Palestine and elsewhere in the Middle East. And I think that in that sense, my paper is very nicely connected to that of Yuval and Lital. However, they also exposed the ongoing tension between the commitment to cultural and social rapprochement and to the exploitation of those frameworks for security and political needs. In a mobilized society such as the Yeshuv, there was inevitably a close link between cultural and educational activities and the advancement of political and security objectives. And indeed, the self-perception of these Jews as mediators was apparent in a very different way in the security sphere as well. With the enhancement of the national conflict, the 1930s and 1940s witnessed the emergence of a new generation of Sephardi and Oriental Jews who became involved in the security apparatus of the Jewish Yeshuv. Disguised as Arabs and speaking Arabic fluently, these Oriental Jews crossed between geographical borders as well as between borders of identity. The Arab department of the Palmach, for example, recruited young Yemenite Oriental Jews, mainly from the poor border neighborhoods in the mixed cities, to serve in their Mista'arvim unit and act in disguise against Arab targets and collect information, either in Palestine or in the neighboring countries. Similarly, the Irgun recruited Oriental Jews to carry out sabotage operations against Arabs. In some cases, the Mista'arvim became so well integrated among their target populations that they could provide unique testimonies on the Palestinian experience of becoming refugees during the 1948 war in the Nakba. Such was the case, for example, with the Yemenite Mista'arev Chavaku Cohen, whom we see here in the picture, who was sent on a mission in the mixed neighborhoods of Haifa, disguised as an Arab. On April 1948, after the Haganah forces launched an offensive in the city, Habakkuk Cohen described the scenes at the eastern gate of Haifa port. There we saw a sad and appalling sight, he wrote. Hundreds of men, women, and children stood in the jetty waiting to board boats that were transferring them to Acre. Women, children, and the elderly were given first place, end of quote. Cohen later then boarded a bus to Beirut, pretending to be a Palestinian Arab. He spent several months in Beirut during the war, mingling with young people in the city. His acquaintances in Beirut included Palestinian refugees he had met in Haifa. He was known in the city as the Dark Palestinian. After the war, Habakkuk Cohen returned to the newly established state of Israel and served in the Israeli military intelligence. Habakkuk's reports and other similar testimonies go beyond intelligence operations in their narrow sense. They allude to the fact that these Mistarvim were intimately involved both as actual participants and as documenters in the changing public mood and atmosphere during the course of the 1948 war. The activities and reports of Habakkuk Cohen and his comrades thus embody an element of mediation between identities and cultures, as well as such elements as documentation and commemoration. Their personal backgrounds of either those who immigrated from Arab countries to Palestine or those who were born and raised in the border neighborhoods in the mixed cities in Palestine demonstrate their complex hybrid Jewish-Arab identity. Thus, a group that considered itself to be responsible for creating bridges to the Arab community now crossed these exact bridges for the purposes of sabotage and intelligence gathering. The criticism and suspicion towards Oriental Jews from certain circles with the Zionist movement, which I don't really have time to go into now, placed those local Jews in a tough position. They were demanded to choose between a local territorial identity as being part of a joint homeland for Jews, Christians, and Muslims, and a Jewish ethno-national identity. The doubts regarding their loyalty and adherence to Zionism highlighted the local Jews' position of otherness vis-a-vis the European hegemonic Zionist circles and created almost a constant need to apologize and protect their own national belief as both loyal Zionists and possible mediators between Jews and Arabs. Returning to Eliashar's comments to the UN committee in 1947 that we started with, his claim that Oriental Jews bore a historic role to serve as a bridge between Jews and Arabs lost its validity after 1948. Indeed, to a large extent, this claim was forgotten and obscured. Those Oriental Jews who viewed themselves both as natives of the Orient and as natives of the country found themselves displaced as a result of 1948, not only from the Orient, but also from their historic position. At the same time, the Sephardi and Oriental Jews who sought to cross the geographical boundaries and the boundaries of identity also contributed in different ways to the very creation of these same boundaries. Hence, it is important, I claim, to bring these Oriental and indigenous voices back to center stage, explore and identify the seeming contradictions and ambivalences in their perception and identity. Thank you.
Thank you so much there for that fantastic talk. Now we're going to move on to Yuval Ivri's talk. Dr. Yuval Ivri is a Leverhulme Early Career Fellow at King's College London. His research focuses on the cultural history of Palestine, the land of Israel at the turn of the 20th century, focusing on Sephardi and Arab Jewish culture and thought. His recent book titled The Return to El Andalus, Dispute over Sephardic Culture and Identity Between Arabic and Hebrew, was published by Magnus Press in 2020. Today's talk is entitled Sephardi Intellectual Visions Between Partitions and Translation. So we welcome you, Yuval, and please, you can go ahead and give your talk now.
Hi, thank you very much, Louis, and thank you very much, Marianne, for the invitation and for the Crime Center for organizing this really wonderful lecture series. And I'm really, really happy to be part of it. And I'm really happy to have the opportunity to speak with my two good friends and colleague, Abigail and Lital. And as you will see, my talk will be really connected to the things that Abigail talked about, and I think as well as to Lital. So I will share a PowerPoint. Okay. So against the backdrop of the intensifying national conflict between Jews and Arabs, a multilingual translational project emerged in Palestine at the turn of the 20th century. While the increasing hostility between Jews and Arabs also opened the linguistic breach between Hebrew and Arabic, a group of local Arab Jewish intellectuals insisted on holding onto both languages, positioned themselves on the borderland between them, and using translation as a political and cultural tool. Over more than 5 decades, from the 1880s to the 1930s, they published hundreds of essays, political commentaries, translations, collections of fables and folk tales, short stories and poems, mostly in the local Hebrew and Arabic newspapers. Moving easily back and forth between Arabic and Hebrew, they marked the first modern phenomena of Hebrew-Arabic literary bilingualism, inspired by the great Arab Jewish poets and philosophers of medieval Al-Andalus. The turn of the 20th century, Palestine was a time of shifting national and imperial orders and an intensifying national conflict between Jews and Arab Palestinians, process which also left its mark on linguistic and cultural arenas. It was a period of partitions. Partition in this context applies not only to the partition of land of Palestine, Israel, but also to the separation of disciplines, traditions, histories, and languages between Hebrew literature and Arabic literature, between Judaism and Islam, Zionism and Arab nationalism, Jewishness and Arabness, and between Sepharad and Al-Andalus. So who then made this group of Jewish intellectuals? The prominent members were Avraham El-Maliach, Yosef Miyuchas, David Yelin, and Yitzhak Binyamin Yehuda. These men were part of a growing circle of local scholars engaged in a variety of intellectual activities: translation, literary interpretation, journalism, lexicography, philology, and education. During the late Ottoman era, they were active members in both Hebrew and Arabic revival movements, the Haskalah and the Nahda. And when the two movements were not yet considered incompatible. During time of political and social upheaval, they developed a multilingual political and literary projects. They were also inspired by the great Andalusi poets and philosophers of medieval Spain. They wrote extensively on the Andalusi thinkers and poets from the 10th to the 12th centuries, such as Maimonides, Saadia Gaon, Moses ibn Ezra, and Ibn Pakude, focusing on their intimate connection to Arabic language, philosophy, and poetry. Those historical figures represented for them an ideal type for Jewish modernization, being inseparably linked to Arabic language and Islamic thought, while reshaping Jewish law and Hebrew philology and poetry. They aspired to revive the memory of Al-Andalus as a political, cultural model, mainly as a platform for joint Jewish and Arab modernization in the Middle East. Some of these activities form part of the emerging Hebrew revivalism movement, but they were also part of the Ottoman and Arabic linguistic and cultural modernizations. This fluidity and mobility between different national, linguistic, and literary affiliations shaped and influenced their intellectual and cultural visions. Figures like El-Maliach, Miyuchas, and Yehuda were often seen as mediators, go-between go-betweens and middlemen, with a cultural affinity to Arabic language and culture and to the local Palestinian Arabs. This later perception put into question their political affiliation and national loyalties, marking them as a hybrid phenomenon operating in the borderland between Hebrew and Arab national poles. Thus, these Arab Jewish intellectuals operated within conflicting political and ideological affinities. Their commitment to the emerging national monolingual Jewish project, their identification with the Ottoman political reformation and the ethos of the shared homeland, and their affiliation to the Arab revival movement and to the joint historical legacy of a Judeo-Muslim and Judeo-Arabic culture. Furthermore, their work developed as a reaction to the emergence of the Hebrew and Arabic national cultural movements. Translation into Hebrew at that formative period played a crucial role in advancing the development of distinct and cohesive Hebrew culture. Writing and translating in national language implied more than ever taking part in the creation of unified national literature and culture. At the heart of the monolingual translational model that was dominant in the Hebrew literary circle of the time lies the assumption that translation is an act that takes place in a monolingual reality and addresses distinct and separate linguistic and cultural traditions. Multilingualism and language mingling, on the other hand, challenges the idea of translation itself. Although some of the translation work of that Arab Jewish network can be counted as part of the national effort to build a modern national Hebrew culture, it also contains subversive elements which undermine the foundation of the very same project. These translations stand out because they do not belong to a uniform religious, national, geographic, or linguistic tradition. Most of their translated materials, including Kalila or Dimna, stories about the prophet from the Islamic oral traditions, collection of fables and proverbs, cross languages, time, space, and culture, providing a unique case study of translations without original written text. They combined oral and written traditions, thus blurring distinctions between author and translator, original and copy. They present a unique multilingual mix of Hebrew and Arabic, which challenges national distinctions, offering exceptional evidence of modern Hebrew-Arabic hybridity. In so doing, these translators did not use translation as a tool for mediation between two separate languages, identities, or traditions, but rather as a mode of textual transmission within the same traditional and linguistic cultural landscape. In the last part of my lecture, I want to focus on two translational works selected from a wide and varied corpus of translations. The first is Yaldei Arav, Children of Arabia, is a translation of collection of biblical tales from the Arab-Palestinian oral tradition by Yosef Miyuchas, published between 1927 to 1929. And the second is Mishlei Arav, Proverbs of Arabia, a comprehensive collection of Arabic proverbs by Yitzhak Binyamin Yehuda. Miyuchas's Yaldei Arav comprise 47 biblical tales from the Arab-Palestinian oral traditions translated into Hebrew. The tales are divided into two parts, Torah stories and prophet stories. The stories are written in a mix of biblical Hebrew, modern Hebrew, and Judeo-Arabic. The translated stories do not reference a specific author or original source. This represents an unusual example of literary writing originating from a bilingual or multilingual context, where writing and translating overlapping in a creative act that is not based on any original. Yehuda's Mishlei Arav, Proverbs of Arabia, includes in its three volumes, some 2,500 proverbs taken from the literary, linguistic, and popular Arabic tradition across the various Arabic dialects. The proverbs are presented in Arabic, in Hebrew script, alongside the Hebrew translation. In some cases, Yehuda also include parallel proverbs in other languages, Judeo-Spanish, Turkish, Aramaic, and Persian, along with Hebrew translation. The intersection between written and oral traditions have a fundamental role in Miyuchas and Yehuda's translational work. While the origins of the translated tales and proverbs are vaguely presented, the biographical links to those traditions is strongly emphasized. Miyuchas and Yehuda's personal background in the borderland between Jewish and Muslim traditions played a seminal role in the formation of their translational work. Miyuchas presents his relation to the Palestinian oral traditions at length in his introductions to the translation works. He describes the influence that his childhood in the Palestinian village Silwan had on the formation of his intellectual and political vision. He stresses that during his formative years in Silwan, the Arab Muslim Palestinian tradition became, as he called it, Girsa de Yankuta, or integral part of his kinship culture. The biographical background had a crucial role also in Yehuda's translation work. Yehuda opened his introduction to the first volume with a declaration regarding the collection process of the proverbs, and I quote, "These proverbs I started to collect for personal use, and I valued proverbs from a young age. Each time I heard a beautiful proverb, I used to write it down, and later, while reading it at books, I highlighted the ones I liked. In that way, I collected many proverbs," end of quote. In the context of the biblical tales, the connectivity between orality and textuality contains a subversive political interpretation. In his translation work, Miyuchas blends between different oral and textual traditions of the biblical stories, mixing Islamic hadith and oral traditions with Jewish midrashic and Talmudic traditions without a clear boundary between them. Furthermore, he uses mixture of biblical Hebrew with Arabic names of places and protagonists, which highlights the multiplicity of optional readings and writings of the biblical narrative. By doing so, Miyuchas offered a different interpretation of the biblical text in the political context of his time. Instead of reconnecting only to one fixed original written text, he positions the biblical stories within their vast array of interpretations and translations in the written and oral traditions, Jewish as well as Muslim, over the ages. This path, in turn, required that Arab Palestinians and their history and stories be included in the text and in the land. For example, in one of his stories, Miyuchas gives the Arabic place name beside the Hebrew place name. And I quote, and I will read it in Hebrew, and you have the English translation here in the slide. ויהי היום ורוח רעה בעטה את מוסה מרוב זקנה ורפיון ידיים ויעזוב את מחנה בנו ישראל ויתהלך שר וזועף על יד חוף בחר לוט, הוא ים המלח בין הסלעים. הוא מתהלך והנה רועה צאן לקראתו, ובהתבוננו בו מקרוב ראה והנה הוא הרועה אשר בידו הפקיד שוחי יהיה בחותנו, הוא יתרו את עדריו לרעותם ביום צאת מוסה את מדיין לשוב מצרימה להוציא את עמו את ישראל מתחת סבלות פרעון. By placing the Arabic name Bahar Lot beside the Hebrew name Yam HaMelach, highlighting the multilingual settings of the historical and contemporary Palestinian landscape and geography. Moreover, at the time of national conflict, when the politics of place naming had a crucial role in discourse and practice, the mixing of Hebrew-Arabic names of places In his translation, destabilized the national effort of separating between languages and territories via toponymic place naming activities and remapping projects that replaced Arabic names with Hebrew names. The layout of the pages in Yehuda's translation reflects its multilingual nature. The translations are not located at the center of the page, but in a format composed of multiple texts, languages, and interpretations, resembling in a way a Talmudic page. And although the Arabic version stands alongside the Hebrew version, there is nothing binary in this layout. In addition, the fact that the Arabic proverbs are written in Hebrew letters only intensify the connectivity between Hebrew and Arabic. One example from Mishle Arav is telling. In the translation of one of the proverbs, the similarities between the Arabic and Hebrew versions are particularly apparent. So I read the number 702, if you see in your slide. So the Arab version is El-Iskafi Khafi ul-Hayek Ariyan. And the Hebrew translation is Ushkafi Yachef va'oreg erom. Beside the usage of Hebrew characters in both languages that highlight the visual similarity between the languages, Yehuda's selection of wording has an additional important effect. Yehuda chose the Hebrew Aramaic word, ushkafi, in his translation of the Arabic word, iskaf, meaning shoemaker. He could use the more common Hebrew word, sandlar, but chose the word that reflects most intensely the connectivity and similarities between the two languages. So I will conclude. At the time when Arabic-Hebrew bilingualism and language mingling was associated with betrayal of the national collective, the translational and literary work of Yehuda and Miyuchas and the other Arab Jewish translators in Palestine refuses to remain confined by distinct borders of language, literature, or religion. Instead, it offers models of coexistence and interaction between literary and linguistic traditions under a single geographical cultural entity, as in Al-Andalus, bringing into contact Islamic, Jewish, Hebrew, and Arabic traditions. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Yuval, for that great talk. Okay, now we are happy to present the last speaker. Lital Levy is an associate professor of comparative literature at Princeton University, where she teaches comparative literature and theory, Hebrew literature, Arabic literature, and Jewish studies. She is the author of the award-winning Poetic Trespass, Poetic Trespass, writing between Hebrew and Arabic in Israel and Palestine, which came out at Princeton University Press in 2014, and numerous other articles on literature, history, and cultural studies. She's completing an intellectual history of Sephardi, Mizrahi, and Arab Jews in the 19th and 20th centuries. Today's talk, she'll be presenting Esther Azhari Moayal, a Jewish woman in the Arab Renaissance. So Lital, please go ahead and start. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Louis. And thank you again to Ma'ayan and to the Crown Center. I'm really delighted to be part of this panel. And to reiterate what Abigail and Yuval said, you'll see the connections between our three talks, and many of the facets of Esther Moyal's experience are direct continuations of the dynamics that they were talking about. So I'm going to just situate my talk in the context of my work on Middle Eastern Jews in the Hebrew Haskalah movement and the Arabic Nahda. And to kind of continue what Yuval was saying about partitions, these are two cultural revivals that took place at about the same time and had some overlap even in terms of where they were taking place. And again, these movements have been partitioned basically by the history writing. And so, you know, working backwards, my specific area of expertise is to try to find the intersections, basically, and understand the positions of Middle Eastern Jews within both of them. So these are two movements that had many similar aims. Although the Hebrew Haskalah movement or the Jewish Enlightenment originated in Europe, it had a Middle Eastern wing that was overlapping in space with the Nahda. And some of these Arab Jewish intellectuals who were bilingual had kind of a foot in each movement, or in some ways mediated between them. But I'm going to be focusing more today on the Nahda, the movement of Arabic cultural revival, which was really kind of a response to both the colonization of the Arab world by Europe, European Enlightenment thought, and kind of frustration at the long Ottoman rule over the Arab world. And this movement emerges in Beirut in the 1830s and is kind of recentered in Cairo in the 1880s, 1890s, which will be part of what I'm discussing today. Now, what's important to understand is that both the Nahda and the Haskalah movements are male-dominated movements, right? There are very few women participating, and this is not through any fault of their own, but for structural reasons. Nonetheless, there are women in the Nahda, actually in both movements, but we're talking today about the Arabic one. And the women who took part in this movement are considered the first wave Arab feminists. And you know, when we talk about feminism in the context of the late 19th century, it's not the feminism that we think of today, but nonetheless, these women were pioneers, and through their writing, they were insisting on their right to have a presence in this emerging sphere of letters. Now, women participated in the Nahda in small numbers, and Esther Azhari Moyal, who is the subject of my presentation today, is unique because she's the only Jewish woman writer in the Nahda movement, at least that we've discovered up till today. She has a really remarkable career, and in retrospect, as we discover more and more about her work, I think it's safe to say that she is turning out to be among the most prolific and important of women writers in the Nahda, but she was largely forgotten for many years. Now, while not all of her activity was centered on her Jewish identity, her Jewishness did play a significant role in her work, and especially in the later years. So I'm going to be giving you a brief biographical narrative, and this is based on some longer work that I've done on her life and times. And we'll just be kind of doing an overview of her activity and her impact on the modern Arabic Renaissance, and also on the Arab Jewish culture of Ottoman Palestine that we've been focusing on in the entire panel. Okay, so Esther Azhari was born in Beirut in 1873 to a Sephardic family whose wanderings had led them from Spain to Istanbul to Acre, and eventually this family resettled in Beirut in the mid-19th century, where their family name was changed from Lazari to El-Azhari. It was just kind of a corruption based on what people heard, and then that became shortened to Azhari. She was the daughter of Abdallah Azhari, who was a silk scrap merchant. That was a very common profession in Beirut at that time. And she seems to have been something of a child prodigy, right? Now, it's very unusual for girls in this time to get the kind of education that she received. So in a later interview, she claimed that as a child, she memorized the Quran and she mastered the formal rules of its recitation, and that she also studied the New Testament. So again, these are unusual for a girl at that time, but especially for a Jewish girl. So we don't know exactly how she even had access to that kind of education. In any case, when she was 11, she began studying at the Syrian Protestant College, which later became the American University of Beirut, where she was taught Arabic and English by a respected Arab writer. She completed her studies at the age of 17 and taught for a few years at local schools, both general schools and also at the Alliance Islamique Universelle, the Jewish school. And in those years, she became very active in the first local Syrian women's associations. These are kind of local circles of women who belonged to what I called that first wave of Arab feminists. And at the same time, she also made her first forays into literary translation. And in her case, she was translating from French to Arabic. Now, her early activity was so remarkable that 2 different items about her appeared in the Paris edition of the New York Herald in these years. So these are both 1892. The first one was, this is from March 28th, 1892, is a reprint, this is on the left. It's a reprint of a letter the letter itself was dated to March 12th from S.S. Sarkis. This is actually Salim Sarkis, who is the editor of Lisan al-Hal, the Mouthpiece, which is a Beirut-based newspaper founded in 1877. This is one of the earliest and most influential Arabic journals of the Nahda period. So in this letter, he's asking the Herald to include Syrian women in their essays on the political condition of women. And he highlights the contributions of Esther Azhari to his newspaper and also speaks of her literary translations. Sarkis then followed it up a few months later with another letter. This is on the right, and this is the one that's titled The Emancipation of Syrian Women. And here he thanks the Herald for printing his first letter and informs them that the censor in Beirut is, quote, too severe in treating the papers, and that the censor is now prohibiting anything being written by or about women in the Syrian papers. So he hopes that Esther Azhari, who he mentioned earlier, will start publishing in the Egyptian newspaper Al-Ahram, the Pyramids. And Esther would indeed go on to publish in some of the other major Arabic newspapers and journals of the time, including Al-Ahram. And she also wrote for Beirut's Arabic language Jewish newspaper, the Israelite World, Al-Alam al-Israeli. Now, one of my favorite pieces of hers from this period is her letter to Al-Hilal, a journal, a cultural journal. Al-Hilal means the crescent moon. And this was a very prestigious journal in its day, kind of like the New Yorker of its time. And this is actually the first signed contribution by any woman to this journal. Now, there might have been other women who contributed previously with pseudonyms or not signing their name at all, because again, it was not really yet quite socially acceptable for women to enter their voices into the public arena. But Esther's letter is the first one where it's under her own name. And I love this piece. Here she's responding to a previous letter by a man about the intellect of women. And here are some excerpts. So she writes, quote, I read the serial article included in your esteemed periodical, signed by Dr. Amin Effendi Khouri. I don't know how it could be that the esteemed doctor places our gender on a par with horses, donkeys, and dogs. How much more appropriate it would have been had he left the birds of his pen in the cages of nightingales, canaries, and parrots. In all truth, I'm utterly flabbergasted. I dispute his claim that the mind of women is confined within a narrow circle. However, I turn my glance to the distinguished ladies who have honored me with their affection, I don't see the respected doctor's judgment applying to them. How often have I attended their meetings and heard their versatility in subjects ranging from the scientific to the religious and the philosophical. And how often have disputants competed before me, one of them belonging to the gender of the esteemed doctor and the other one to our weak gender, that which is incapable of obtaining the doctor's regard. Proofs were exchanged and the debaters moved from one topic to the other. And the woman was the grace of the debate, if we don't say the winner. Furthermore, I remind the esteemed doctor that women have not entered the door of scholarship and belles-lettres until recently, due not to any shortcomings of their own, but rather because of the strong sex's disdain for them. The mocking of educated women by the French poet Molière and others suffices as a just witness to my words and supports my claims. So this gives you a taste of her writing. And as you can see, she was a passionate advocate of women and had a bold and fiery writer's voice. Now, sometime during these same years, Esther Azhari made the acquaintance of Shimon Moyal, who was a Jewish student from Jaffa, who had also become active in Nahda circles. and who was studying medicine in Beirut at the time. So Esther and Shimon were engaged in 1893. That was the year before she wrote that letter. And they were married in 1894, the year that the letter came out. And the newlywed couple then moved to Istanbul, where Shimon was obtaining his Ottoman medical license. In 1896, Shimon received his license, and then they, for a number of years, they were moving around. They were in Safed, Tiberias, and Beirut, and then finally resettled in Cairo in 1899. And in Cairo, they joined a large community of Syrian intellectuals and writers who had migrated to that city largely for the reasons that were mentioned in Sarkis's letter to the Herald. Because there was a greater degree of intellectual freedom there, and they were not as bothered by the censors. They had more freedom to publish. Now, in that same year, Esther, this is 1899, Esther is now a young mother. She founded her own periodical, which was called Al-Aila, the family. And this appeared as an Arabic women's journal through 1902, and then it was briefly revived in 1904. This journal was widely circulated within Egypt and beyond. Issues from the first year focused primarily on questions of mother-child relations, health, hygiene, nursing, and education. But in addition to these articles on domestic and literary topics, Moyal also printed lengthy features on world affairs, which was really atypical of women's publications at that time. And also, although the journal was aimed at a general Arab readership, the paper occasionally discussed Jewish matters. For instance, in an August 1904 edition, Esther praises a new history of the Jewish people in Arabic that was written by a Christian author. In its review, in Al-Muqtataf, which was another highbrow journal, in its review of the first issue of Al-Aila, it notes that Esther Moyal quotes Rabbi Akiva, the famous 2nd century Palestinian rabbi and legal authority who's considered the father of rabbinic Judaism, on breastfeeding, saying that the mother who declines to nurse her own child is no better than a barren woman. So it's pretty interesting that Moyal invokes him as a source of authority in an article that's aimed at contemporary Arab women readers. Alongside journalism, literary translation, which we just heard a lot about from Yuval, constituted another really important facet of the Nahda, enriching the Arabic language and familiarizing Arab readers with the short story and novel, and also just other genres such as theater. Moyal was probably the most, well, or possibly one of the most prolific female translators of French into Arabic in her time. She translated about a dozen French novels. And interestingly, in an article in Al-Aila called The Eastern Renaissance, Nahda Sharqiyya, she calls for the translation of recent Arabic writings to European languages. In other words, for translation in the other direction, from Arabic to French and English. And there she's highlighting a shortcoming, right? Where the flow of direction was overwhelmingly from European languages into Arabic. Additionally, she translated dozens of short dramas into Arabic, also from French, to be staged at Arab schools, and in particular at the National Jewish School, which was an Arabic language Jewish boarding school in Beirut. Now, her most significant achievement from these early years of the 20th century is without a doubt her 1903 Arabic language biography of the French writer Émile Zola, whose dates were 1840 to 1902. In the book's introduction, she explains that her biography was inspired by Zola's defense of Alfred Dreyfus, the Jewish French army captain falsely accused of espionage in 1887. Towards 1896, as public doubts grew concerning France's handling of the case, the topic began receiving more coverage in the Arabic press. In 1898, Émile Zola famously rose to Dreyfus's defense in his open letter to the president of the French Republic, Jacques. So at this point, for the Arab world as elsewhere, the Dreyfus affair became a defining moment in the development of modern journalism. So this is a moment in which the newspaper emerges as a tool of social and political critique and an arena for exposing corruption and demanding reform. As the sole expression of an Arab-Jewish perspective, Moyal's writings on the Dreyfus Affair offer us a unique window onto its relevance to non-European Jewry, as well as to the Arabic reading public. Esther's introduction to her Zola biography is amazing for many reasons. And one of those is her immense erudition in classical Arabic and in Islamic heritage. For example, she quotes the poetry of Abu Tayyib al-Mutanabbi, the 10th century poet who's considered the gold standard of classical Arabic poetry. Like other good Arabic writers, she writes using the cultural stock of the Arabic language and its classical heritage, quoting freely from the Quran. So for example, she writes, Zola has died, and his death was announced to the people the morning after they read his book. That book, free of doubt, was a guide to the judiciary and a light revealing truth and dispelling falsehood. Okay, now in Arabic, this last sentence reads, ذلك الكتاب لا ريب فيه هدى للقضاء ونور أزهر الحق فأزهق الباطل. That line, that book, free of doubt, was a guide to judgment. In other words, to the judiciary, law, or justice, quotes directly from Surat al-Baqarah, the cow, which is the second chapter of the Quran. The next line, Nur azhar al-haq fa azhaq al-batil, a light revealing truth and dispelling falsehood. This alludes to another chapter of the Quran entitled Banu Israel, or Al-Isra, which is the children of Israel. Esther Moyal's deployment of these verses from the Quran within a secular text can be seen as expressing a kind of cultural Islam, like a way of saying, I am Jewish, but my culture as an Arabic language writer, my literary culture is Islamic. And at the same time, using this Arabic that's so rich in Islamic references, she is making her viewpoints about the Dreyfus Affair known. And she's extremely critical of French anti-Semitism and the involvement of the French clergy, and especially the Jesuits in the affair. The rest of the biography is compiled largely from her readings of the French and English press. So she discusses Zola's life and his literary accomplishments, but there's significant attention in the book to the Dreyfus Affair and its coverage in the press, as well as different responses to Zola's death. And all in all, the book really is a stunning achievement. Okay, now not long after the Young Turk Revolution in either 1908 or 1909, the Moyals moved back to Jaffa, where they became very active in local politics. And this brings us directly to the topic of Abigail's talk. So at this point, the Moyals, their primary focus was really on the Palestinian scene. They were local activists and they were loyal Ottomanists, meaning that they supported the continuation of Ottoman rule over the region, but they were also in favor of Jewish settlement in Palestine. And ultimately, they envisioned a homeland for Jews and Arabs within an Ottoman political framework. So they take on this kind of mediating role that Abigail discussed for us. During this time, Esther continued to contribute articles to the Arabic press and founded another women's organization. And she edited a new Jaffa-based Arabic paper called Al-Akhbar, or just the news. She continued to write on women's issues in a wide variety of venues. And she gave local presentations at public events in Jaffa. And a different example was a graduation speech delivered at the American College for Girls back in Beirut, which she gave in 1911, in which she speaks with clarity and with vigor about the challenges for women in the Arab East. And in particular about the necessity for a proper education for Arab women that is comparable to the education at this point available to many women in the West. This speech contains what would have then been considered a really strong feminist message. And it's important to note that at this point in her career, she is couching this message not in terms of the needs of the family, which was a dominant trend of the 19th century feminism. And that was the kind of rhetoric that was in her newspaper, that women needed to be educated because they were the main influence in the family and the household manager and the dominant influence on their children. But actually in this speech, she is claiming women really need to be educated to serve the needs of society and nation and the region. And this kind of shift in her rhetoric reflects the emerging Arab nationalist discourse. So for a brief period around this time, Esther, Shimon, and a third Sephardic writer named Nissim Malul, he's also Palestinian, founded a newspaper called The Voice of Ottomanism that was intended to defend Zionist viewpoints in the local Arabic press. And here's another clearer view of the masthead. But this was unfortunately a very short-lived newspaper because shortly thereafter, the war broke out, the First World War, and then the authorities shut it down. So this is an issue you're looking at from 1914. Okay, now the war was a really terrible time in Ottoman Palestine. It was quite dramatic. A lot of people left. There was a lot of hunger, bad time. In early 1913, Shimon had been appointed a medical officer in Ramla and Lida in Palestine. And unfortunately, he dies in the war in 1915. Following his untimely demise, the now widowed Esther departs for Marseille, it's a city in southern France, and thereafter she drops off the radar. Okay, so at the moment, there's a frustrating lack of information about her time in France, but I'm hoping that I'll be able to pursue the trail and find some new information. So the next sign of life we have from her appears 2 decades later in 1936, when she's listed in a directory that shows her living on 3 Lily and Bloom Street in Tel Aviv, and this is the building today. I only wish we could have seen it in 1936, but it looks like you could still see some of the original architectural features. And then the following year, in 1937, she writes a letter to Shlomo Dov Goitein, the famous Jewish historian of the Cairo Geniza, who is then based at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, offering to lecture there in Arabic. So we know that at this point, she's still trying to do something with her expertise. You know, whether or not she was successful, I don't believe she was invited, but she's at least trying. And then there's nothing more from the archives, at least that I found so far, until 1944, when she's visited by Yaakov Yoshua, who is a scholar and journalist. His son is the famous Israeli novelist, A.B. Yoshua. His report is bleak. He finds her seemingly abandoned and forgotten, living alone in poverty and becoming senile. She's unable to recall the titles of the dozens of books that she had translated. He writes, quote, "After I brought up some fragmented memories of her life and times, I took leave of her. And in my heart was the feeling that I had walked amongst ruins and landslides, amongst broken souls that resented me for disturbing their rest after they had been forgotten by the dead and by the living alike." So on that bleak note, in what may be read as an act of involuntary symbolism, Esther Azhari Moyal died in 1948, the very year of Israel's independence. We don't yet know the reasons for this sad ending to such an accomplished life, why she was alone, why she wasn't living with any of her children. But I think we can guess at why she was forgotten for so long. By 1948, her life's project was obsolete. She had left the Arab world behind for Palestine, and the old Palestinian society, with its mix of Hebrew and Arabic cultures, had been partitioned and effectively destroyed. The new Jewish state had moved in a completely different direction, both culturally and politically. It was really not until a few years ago that those of us who are deeply interested in that old mixed society of early 20th century Palestine started digging into the lives of the Moyals and realized her importance. There's still more to discover about her remarkable story, and hopefully time will fill in the gaps. Thank you.
Lital, for that fascinating talk. Okay, now I think we'll invite all the panelists to join in. I'll ask a round of questions, one for each. Then we can get to the questions and answers we have here. I think what we see here, and this is a main theme of my work, is that we still know so very little about the earlier periods of Zionism and Palestinian history and the intersections between them. And what's fascinating is what I would argue even is that what we see here in all the papers is, and something I've been working on, is the need to reassess the Israeli historical narratives of the first Aliyah and the second Aliyah. And I think that's something that comes out very much so here. I wanted to first, I'll go ahead and ask each question to, I'll put out one for each person, and then you can answer them. So the first question, let me get my notes here. Sorry about this. Second. Yeah, Abigail, the first question I would ask would be to look at how does the Sephardic and the Arab Jewish experience transform from the late Ottoman period to the Mandate period. So what I see in the late Ottoman period is that and I would even stress that they're essential figures in the Zionist movement. They are very visible and they're very active. And then we see by the time towards the late Mandate, they're actually being co-opted into the security operations, and they become, less central as the rise of Mapai and the labor movement becomes more dominant, which actually I argue in the second Aliyah, they really were during that period, before World War II, that they weren't as dominant as the history might have portrayed them. I'm talking about Mapai. So how does the role of that experience transform from pre-World War I and then after, during the war and after? Let me go ahead and ask all the questions, and then you all can get a chance to answer. So now, Yuval, the question for you would be, what was that tension between preserving Arabic when at the same time you now have very different than let's say the Baghdadi experience or the Damascus experience or the Cairo experience, where you now have Hebrew alongside Arabic. And, on one hand, you're trying to preserve the Arabic, but on the other hand, this is coming on the account that Hebrew is becoming the dominant language, both of of Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews, but in the Yeshuva itself. So how do you see that dynamic where, like I said, very different than, let's say, Baghdad or different places where Arabic becomes the main dominant language, and also perhaps looking into where Ottoman Turkish comes in here, because Avram el-Meliach also was writing in Ottoman Turkish quite prolifically. And the last question I have for Lital would be my question would be, is how that tension between Esther and Shimon coming back to Palestine as adamant Zionists, how does that play in generally speaking, what I see, and I recently finished something on this, is that they were completely unable to build bridges with the local Palestinian population. They have very strong ties in Cairo, they have strong ties in Beirut, but within the local Palestinian Arab front, they're unable to build these bridges, at least within among the more dominant people, whether it's parliamentary members in the Ottoman Empire, or let's say in the newspaper Palestine and other newspapers. So I look at Salta Osmania and I say, it's a very interesting project, but what I argue is that it's more of a propaganda project for Zionism to convince the local Arab population, and they don't buy it. So how is that, how does that affect them? The last question that really interested me in the past was, what was Esther's role in Palestine, the much smaller Palestine, as a woman? And it seems to me that she was much more silenced in Palestine compared to, let's say, Beirut or in Cairo, the bigger cities, the more cosmopolitan cities. And then we'll hear the answers here, and then we'll go to the questions of the audience. Yeah, please, Abigail.
Thanks, Louis, and thank you, Yuval and Lital, for such fascinating talks, which really, I think, very, very nicely kind of speak to each other. So, Louis, just to answer your question briefly, the shift between the Ottoman period or the late Ottoman period and the mandatory British colonial period is actually very, very significant in understanding the role and the position of the Oriental Jews, the local Jews we're talking about. Within the Ottoman, without getting to too much of Ottoman history here, within the Ottoman apparatus or within the Ottoman framework, the Sephardi Jews were the only Jews who actually represented the Jewish millet, the Jewish community. And as such, they were the ones who actually spoke up and had a significant role within the Jewish community in Palestine. When, with the demise of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I, they basically lost this position, which was quite a significant one. And we can argue and we can talk for hours, the three of us, and the four of us actually, about how significant it was, how important they were, you know, politically speaking, et cetera, but they basically lost this position of the representatives of the Jewish millet. And with the transition into the British colonial rule, they were trying, and this is the argument that Moshe, Naor, and myself are making in our book, they were trying to position themselves and to position themselves within the changing circumstances of the Zionist movement, within the Zionist apparatus, basically, which gained a lot of power and momentum, of course, following the demise of the Ottoman period and the Ottoman Empire and the rise of the British mandatory rule, as well as within the changing circumstances and dynamics between Jews and Arabs. And basically the new position that they kind of adopted and tried to accomplish was that position of mediation, which I tried to demonstrate in my talk. Now, this mediation position, which again is very, 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 very delicate and it's really, really important to understand how delicate it was, because one cannot compare the social and cultural mediation or political mediation to the latter part of my talk with the security mediation that I introduced. So this kind of mediation came in different roles and positions and contexts. But this role as mediators was exactly what they were trying, how they were trying to form their new position, their new status, their new kind of message and in a way new identity, new role within the Zionist and the Jewish and Arab apparatus of the time.
Great, thanks, Yuval.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Louis, for the question. And yeah, I want to connect to what Abigail said and to your question to Abigail, because before I'm addressing the question of language, and I think that part of our problem, our trap as researchers of this kind of this period and specific of this kind of intellectuals, that we're already thinking and writing from a post-partition perspective, meaning we already assume that there is a national-centric view. So you already try to say, oh, okay, they were propaganda Zionist or not propaganda Zionist or Palestinian. And of course, the monolingual context we're going to, so we already assume there is completely separation between Hebrew and Arabic, and there is a situation of multilingual, that they have different languages, Turkish, Arabic, Hebrew, and we know that the situation was much more complex, and people spoke in different languages. The languages and the differentiation between languages was quite blurred, and that's the moment when partitioning process is starting. So in a way, we need to try to trace this partitioning project and try to look what they suggested in that, and it's quite a complex achievement, because the readers and the people that now are seeing us, or the people that we are speaking to, are already assume partition, assume borders, assume differentiation between people. And so, of course, I would say that all the sectarian context is very important. I'm talking about Osama Makdisi's work is very important to understand to understand Moyal, the couple Moyal and their discussion with Christians, Palestinians. Some of it's not only national and Zionist and not Zionist, it's inter-Ottoman that wasn't only in Palestine, it was in other places. There was and that's how they, in ways, that's how they praise it and look at it. And the same I would say with Arabic and Hebrew. And in my work, I'm trying now to say, to try to define it, how, in what moment take Yitzhak Yehuda's translation work, is for him a translation from an Arabic to Hebrew. And when you look at it, there's no translation from Arabic to Hebrew as we see it between two monolingual languages, because you have Arabic with the different kind of dialects in his text, and you have Judeo-Spanish, and he shows the connection to Aramaic, and there's Aramaic in the Hebrew, and there is, and of course there's Turkish, and they have Persian, and all these kind of things are in this translation project. The same I will say about Miyuchad, I say about other projects that they do mainly in the end of the Ottoman Empire. You can see a shift after that, and if you want, I can elaborate about it. But I think that what we need to think is to start to approach their work from a post-monolingual approach that try to be more critical about our understanding of differentiation between languages at the time and between communities and groups in the time.
Yeah, fantastic. Great. Thanks so much, sir. Lital, please. Lital, you're muted.
Thank you. Sorry about that.
Great.
So concerning the first part of the question about, you were saying that the Moyals kind of failed to build bridges in Palestine with the local, intellectuals compared to how integrated they were in Cairo and Beirut. I think, again, to kind of reiterate what Yuval said, it depends on where you're looking and specifically what issues. And I would agree that they failed to make inroads on the Zionist question. And that was, at that point, Shimon's dominant concern. But at the same time, I mean, Esther did continue to be very active in terms of the women's issue. So I don't see her as being silenced there. She was continuing to publish. I have numerous publications from her during those years. She was still publishing in Beirut, not only in the local press, and she was still, like I said, giving talks. I mean, she apparently went back to Beirut to give that graduation speech. And if anything, what I was saying in my presentation was that the rhetoric of both her writing and her presentations that were reprinted on the women's question actually shifted in those years to become, I think even more feminist in the sense that she was no longer only speaking about the women's role within the domestic sphere, but really seeing women as having the right to work, having the right to have a professional existence, and couching it in terms of the needs of society. And I think what's really interesting, and again, sort of hard to understand to adopt Yuval's terms from a post-partition perspective, is that during these years, she's giving these kind of, very Arab nationalist talks. They're anti-colonial, they're very strident. And she's also at the same time advocating for the Zionist project. She doesn't see a contradiction. So, the Arab intellectuals that she's communing with, as you're saying, she's not getting traction. They're not buying the Zionist part, but at the same time, they're still really, fiercely resistant to Europe's colonial exploits. And on your note about kind of why they don't make any progress on the Zionist question, I mean, that's not specific to Palestine. So for example, Shimon Moyal had a correspondence with Rashid Rida years earlier while he was still in Cairo on the Zionist question, where they went back and forth for a while and he just, failed to persuade Rida, and Rida was printing this in Al-Manar. It was just that, the Arab leadership and intellectuals, were not sympathetic to Zionism. There was nothing that the Moyals were going to be able to do that was going to change that. Right. But at the same time, they were active on other issues. So I think the bottom line is that it's a little bit more complicated than simply saying, well, they kind of, lose their relevance when they're in Palestine because they're focused on Zionism and they're not really making any progress there.
Just a correction. I meant she was silenced within the Jewish Yishuv. Actually, this is what I was. This is what I was speaking about. I wasn't speaking about. She continues her career in Beirut and in Cairo, and Moyal and Malouf.
I misunderstood. Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah, but that's the language. That's just a language issue because she doesn't. I don't know to what extent she spoke Hebrew or didn't speak Hebrew. All of her writings were in Arabic, and so she has like a few letters that appear in the Hebrew press, but they were apparently translated for her. I think that's the main reason that she's silenced, is because she's not participating in Hebrew language debates.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's exactly the point that I was getting at. Okay, great, very good. Let's go to some questions here. Let me go to And this is, I think, it will highlight some of what we talked about. This is from David Corwin. He writes, and any of you can go ahead and jump in and answer it. Before the Zionist movement, e.g. in the 1840s, he writes, was there a real distinction between Jews in Palestine and non-Jewish Arabs in Palestine? Or was it no different than the distinction between Muslim Arabs and Christian Arabs in Palestine? Would there have been a word for the category of non-Jewish Arabs, like how the word Palestinian is used today? So let's go ahead and we'll do one by one. If we can keep short answers, because we have like 3 or 4 questions here. But does someone want to address that among the group, or each of you? Can you guys also see the questions?
I'm trying to catch up on the question here. 1 second.
Yeah. So if you go, it's David Corwin's question. He was the first one to ask a question. And it says, before the Zionist movement, was there a real distinction between Jews in Palestine and non-Jewish Arabs in Palestine? Or was it no different than the distinction between Muslim Arabs and Christian Arabs in Palestine? Would there have been a word for the category of non-Jewish Arabs? Yes.
The Jews in Palestine were many communities. I think we need to just begin with that it wasn't a single, monolithic community. And so I think that different communities would have been referred to as such, right? There were Ashkenazi Jews, there were Maghrebi Jews, there were Sephardi Jews. So I would start with that. And I'll let my colleagues elaborate.
Let me just add on what Lital said. The Jewish community in Palestine was not born and did not start with the rise of Zionism, obviously, right, to Palestine. And we need to remember this. So before the Zionist immigration, the first Zionist wave of immigration in 1882, there was a very, a thriving Jewish community, which in kind of traditional Zionist historiography is called Hayeshuv Hayeshan, like the old Zionist Jewish community, versus what was later called Hayeshuv Hadash, which is the new Jewish community, based on the idea that the Zionist community kind of renewed Jewish existence in Palestine. This is not exactly true, and it has been criticized in the last, I would say, 10 years or so, this idea, historiographic idea about the new versus the old Yeshuv. But definitely there were differences between the Jewish community and the Arab community, or the Jewish communities, as Lital was saying, in the Arab community. I don't know if we have time to get into it, but there were also a lot of issues, a lot of similarities between those communities. So the short answer is yes. Very
good. Let's go ahead and move to the next question. And this is to anyone that wants to jump in. Can you say something about Aleph, Yeshua's father, an Arabist himself, and his views?
I can answer that briefly, or I don't know. So
right.
But I also just wanted to note, just so we get to them, that there are questions also in the chat.
Yeah, we're going to go back. We're going to go back to those. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So yes, he is a native of Jerusalem, from the Sephardic community in Jerusalem. He becomes kind of sort of like an autodidact scholar. He's a very active, very prolific journalist, publishes prolifically, really, in the Hebrew press, and also does a number of kind of like historical ethnographic studies over the years. He's fluent in Arabic, I believe also Ladino and Hebrew. And so he actually went and sought out Esther Moyal on the basis of articles that he had read about her way earlier. We're talking like in Arabic from the late 19th century, and kind of just wanted to know what happened to her. And he'd also been interested in the story of Shimon, and so he finds her living in poverty, unfortunately. But this is just one of many, many, many articles that he wrote in the Hebrew press in those years, in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s. Feel free to add on to that, Yuval or Abigail.
I would just say that there is a few for us as historians that go into a topic that was understudied. So you have few historians that are not official historians, and they are very, very useful for us. They are prolific and they are very useful. So of course, Yaakov Yehoshua is one of them. I will add Avraham ben Yaakov, a very important figure that wrote a lot and was very, Moshe David Gaon, another father of Yoram Gaon, the singer, it was an important figure as well. So you have few of them in that time that for us, they are very important sources. And I think for students can be a very important sources as well.
Perfect. Go ahead, please.
Let me just add another important fact here about Yaakov Yoshua, that he writes under, sometimes he can be found as Yoshua ben Hananiah, right?
Yeah.
Yoshua ben Hananiah, I think the first
Yoshua
name
ben Hananiah, yeah.
Yoshua ben Hananiah, and he writes a lot in the journal Hed HaMizrach or HaMizrach. Again, this is something for future research, those who are interested.
Why was he, quickly, does anyone know why was he using a pen name at this point?
I'm not sure about the reason. Maybe Lital knows, or Yuval, I don't know really.
Now, many of them used back in the days.
Yeah, but I don't know why specifically this one.
Yeah.
Great. So let me go to another question, then we'll go to the chat. This is the last one that these questions answers. Maital writes, "Thank you all for a fascinating lecture. Thank you all for fascinating lectures. I'm wondering about continuation of these views, activities that all presented after 48. Why do you think the despair of these Mizrahi Sephardi intellectuals was so great that it was stopped?" Then she puts in parentheses, "There's a newspaper that is trying to keep it the Orient, but it seems like with not much success." And then she goes on, "And do you think it is correct to say that it somehow began again by others that came to the state of Israel after the big aliyot from Muslim countries in the early 50s? And do you all believe that this kind of discourse can be relevant today? Thank you."
Okay, I can answer. First of all, Metal, thank you very much, and I think it's very important to see there's different moments. If you go into history, we can put it in different kind of histories, of course. But one of history, if you want to do a Middle Eastern Jewry thought or Arab Jewish thought, so there is modern. So there is few moments, and of course the Ottoman moment, and you have the transition from the Ottoman to the mandatory to the British, and of course 48 is another. People will say 29. If you read the Moshe Naor and Avigail's great book, you can see that 29 and 36 are important moments, the moments of violence. But 48 is another important moment, and all of them, if you can trace a Middle Eastern Mizrahi thought that have differences and changes. Some of the time you have some connection between them. Definitely in going back to the Hed HaMizrach in the 40s, 50s, of course they have connections. Some of them of the same people. And then later, some of the ideas are connecting. You can see today in the margins of Mizrahi intellectuals and activists that some of them are going back to this activists. Some of them are going back to them as radical thinkers or critical thinkers of Zionism or of Westernization of Jewish culture. But some of them are, and there's just a book was published now, as to show that also Mizrahi Jewry was part of Zionism. So they were one of the first people that wrote about Zionism. I think part of this kind of conflicting aspect, and I think part of the problem is this kind of a post-partition perspective that needs to put them into boxes that already we have it today, and we don't give them enough space to be in contradictions, as Lital said, and Abigail, that there were Zionist and Arab and Hada, and there were Ottomanist, and they had this kind of contradiction that we don't have any space to it today. I would say that's one of the problems with it.
Perfect, great. So let's go ahead. We only have 6 more minutes. I'm trying to get a few more minutes leeway here, but we'll see. I'm in the negotiations in the chat right now for 5 more minutes. But let's go ahead. We had some more questions here. I think this is from Mayan. The questions it's in the chat. It's for Abigail. Why did the Zionist movement allow Oriental Jews to serve as Mistaravim, but not to integrate as decision makers in the Zionist movement, especially in light of their ability to mediate between the Zionist movement and the local Arab population?
So this is the $1 million question, in a way. And the answer is long. I'll try to shorten it. So basically, the Zionist movement had different, let's say the hegemonic Zionist Mapai, labor Zionism, Zionist circles had a very complex feeling towards those Oriental Jews, or what we call Bnei Haaretz, the natives of the country, and towards their attempt to create this new position for themselves as mediators. We're talking here about, as I think Yuval was mentioning as well, about some very, very strong feelings of trying to position those people as not loyal to the Zionist mission and to the Zionist message, etc., etc. And I didn't mention here the way the Arabs reacted towards those people, which is also important here to mention. Basically the first generation, I would say, the generation of the old guard of those Sephardi Jews who were educated in the Ottoman milieu, in the Ottoman framework, they kind of had all the time to defend their position, their place, their role, etc. Their sons, like the second generation, already grew up in a totally different atmosphere than the atmosphere that the fathers or the older generation grew up in. They grew up within the conflict, within the realities, the very harsh realities of the conflict. They also were raised, many of them, in the center of activity, let's say, turned and shifted from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv, which is also important. So we have a generational issue here, and we have a geographical issue, a shift from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv. And this younger generation kind of tried to justify and to prove itself and its loyalty vis-a-vis to the Zionist circles by playing a role in the security apparatus. And again, this needs to be understood in the context of the yeshuv, of the Jewish yeshuv at the time, and the whole discussion, everything was taking place within the, this context of a kind of a society which is totally embedded within the need to defend itself, to fight against the Arabs, to fight against the British in any possible way. I'm not sure that I totally answered the question, but I tried.
Perfect, thanks. Let's go to Lital, and then one more question for Yuval. We only have like 3 or 4 minutes, but Lital, I'll go ahead and shoot here. What were the unique conditions that allowed Esther Asari Moel to be involved in and contribute to the Mel Nahda movement? How did the male intellectuals of the Nahda relate to her? And did they refer, quote, or correspond with her writings?
Well, in terms of the second part of the question, I partially addressed that within my presentation. If you recall, the editor of Lisan al-Hal had, written to the New York Herald about her. So, he was encouraging her. He even referred her to the editor of Al-Ahram. So to put this into context, there were male writers in the Nahda movement who were very supportive of the women who were writing and who were actually using it as a platform to try to encourage women to publish and to have a voice in the movement. But again, there's a variety of viewpoints. These things are never monolithic. And there are also men writing, like the one that Esther was responding to in Al-Hilal, who were claiming that women were intellectually inferior to men. And that was exactly the kind of thing that these women intellectuals, were basically coming up against. So they had their supporters, they had their detractors. But the conditions that allowed women, I think, to participate in the first place, it's complex. Some of it is that there are, kind of emerging educational opportunities for them that weren't available previously, and not only for them, but also for boys, right? That there's kind of, new schools, new types of schools. We still don't quite understand how Esther acquired, the amazing educational background that she did, but there are always anomalies. There are girls who have fathers who are supportive and who educate them at home. I think each case is a little bit unique, but what's happening is basically a cultural shift in which, the newspaper is opening up as a space where people can contribute. And again, some women did so anonymously, some women did so under pen names, but some women are beginning, in this phase to do so publicly and to try to open a space for other women. So I could elaborate more, but since we're short on time, I'll leave it at that.
Great. Thanks so much. The very last question, and then maybe Mayan can join us back here. This is for Yuval. Did Jewish and Arab students know or study these works and translations of the Sephardic intellectuals in those years. And then also to follow up, to what extent students in Israel today are familiar with the works of these intellectuals that you have spoken about today?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. I think that regarding the first part of the question, yes, they started this translation project in the 1880s and 1890s. It was published in the Hebrew periodicals, but part of it, because they were the first educators of Hebrew in Hebrew and Arabic, some of them were Arabic teachers in Jewish schools, they wanted to use this kind of this kind of proverbs and stories from an Arabic culture to educate in Hebrew, to teach Hebrew, because they say we lack of stories and materials. We want to, part of this kind of translation project was also for education. So in the beginning, the generations of that studied in the 1890s, 80s and 90s were familiar with this kind of text. Some of them were published, the end result of it was published as a book in the 1920s and 30s, and that was already a moment of marginalization of this kind of figures. But in the end of the 19th century, they were quite known in the, again, Hebrew Haskalah circles. About today, most of the people won't know anything about these figures, even though they were very, very important. As you, Louis, said, and others, they are very important figure in their time. They wrote a lot extensively. There's now a revival to go in certain academic circles, but in the public sphere, nobody will know these names, even though most of them maybe have some in Jerusalem, a name on them. Like Avraham Shalom Yehuda have a street name in Jerusalem, but in Jerusalem, everybody thought it's about three boys that died in a war that call Avraham Shalom and Yehuda, because nobody knows this great figure, Avraham Shalom Yehuda in Israel.
Great. Well, thank you all for such a fascinating talks, and the discussion was great afterwards. Mayan, I'll hand it over to you now.
So thank you so much, Louis, Yuval, Lital, and Abigail. We are really looking forward seeing you all in 2 weeks, exactly in 2 weeks, Sunday at 11 for our next event about Arab Jewish culture in Israel today. So please register, and for more details, you can find all of the details and registration links in our website of the Crown Family Center at Northwestern University. So thank you so much and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.